On February 19th, 2026, the United States Geological Survey recorded something that had not happened since 1963. The southern portion of the Great Salt Lake dropped to a new historic low, just over an inch below the previous record that had stood for 63 years. The USGS data chief for Utah's Water Science Center, Ryan Rowland, did not mince words about what comes next. Based on current trends and historical data, the USGS anticipates water levels may decline an additional foot over the next several months. Samaritans purse one more foot. On a lake that is already the lowest it has been in recorded history. On a lake that is simultaneously the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere and one of the fastest disappearing bodies of water in North America. On a lake whose exposed lakebed, already 800 square miles of bare, toxic sediment open to the wind, sits directly upwind of 3 million people who live in one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the United States. The record was broken quietly. There were no emergency declarations, no evacuation orders, no congressional hearings convened in the week that followed. The data came in, the USGS published it, the local papers covered it, and the Wasatch Front continued to grow, and the lake continued to fall, and the dust continued to blow. This is how an environmental catastrophe unfolds when it moves slowly enough that no single day looks like the disaster it actually is. Begin with what the lake actually is, because the popular understanding of the Great Salt Lake, a quirky, hyper-salty body of water where you float without effort and not much else lives, is almost entirely wrong. The surface area of the lake has shrunk by 2/3. American Red Cross. What remains is less than a third of what existed a century ago. The lake that once covered over 3,000 square miles at its historic high in 1986 and 1987 now covers roughly 1,000 square miles of open water and 800 square miles of exposed, drying lakebed. That lakebed, what was water and is now sediment open to the sky, is approximately the total surface area of the island of Maui. It is not sand, it is not clean soil. It is the accumulated residue of decades of industrial activity, agricultural runoff, and natural geological processes, compressed into a playa that contains arsenic, lead, lithium, uranium, antimony, and other heavy metals at levels above EPA residential and industrial standards. And every time the wind blows from the west, it lifts that material into the air above Salt Lake City, Ogden, Provo, and the other communities of the Wasatch Front, where 80% of Utah's population lives. Sediments in the lakebed contain elevated levels of natural and human-caused compounds, such as arsenic. As the lake dries, more of this sediment is exposed, which can be picked up by wind and affect communities nearby. Here is the detail that tells the real story. In April 2026, researchers at Utah State University published a study that moved the dust problem from an air quality concern into something that no one had previously measured at the Great Salt Lake. Scientists collected dust from Farmington Bay and applied it to cabbage plants grown in a greenhouse. After 2 applications, plant tissue absorbed metals and metalloids from the dust, including arsenic, sodium, and uranium. Other contaminants, like lead, collect on the leaves. The researchers found some metals lingered within cabbage exposed to Great Salt Lake dust even after thorough washing. Saipan Tribune. The dust is not just something people breathe during windstorms. It is something that gets deposited on the leafy vegetables growing in backyard gardens across northern Utah. It settles on soil. It enters plants through their roots and through their surfaces. Lead collects on leaves. Arsenic and uranium absorb into tissue. The lead scientist said, "There's the phrase after the dust settles, and we usually think that means the problem is over. But with Great Salt Lake dust, that's actually where a different set of processes can begin." Saipan Tribune. Those processes have a name in toxicology. They are called pathways of chronic exposure. They are the difference between a dust storm that irritates your throat for a day and a decade of slowly accumulating heavy metals in the bodies of people who never knew they were being exposed. Particles from the lakebed don't just irritate the lungs, they dissolve into the bloodstream, potentially leading to heart attacks, strokes, blood clots, asthma, and even cancers. Pregnant women and children are particularly vulnerable because of increased blood flow to growing tissues and the higher respiratory rates in children. The Daily Caller and the communities bearing the highest exposure are not the ones with the most resources to respond. When wind kicks up toxic dust from the dry lakebed of the shrinking Great Salt Lake, it has an outsized impact on disadvantaged communities along the Wasatch Front. The research found some of Salt Lake City's low-income neighborhoods are situated directly in the path of dust that blows off the lake. That pollution has a disproportionate impact among Pacific Islanders and Hispanics, and the more lake levels decline, the more these neighborhoods will be impacted. Saipan Tribune. The dust does not distribute itself evenly across the metropolitan area. It follows the wind, and the wind follows geography, and the geography of the Wasatch Front places certain communities in the drift path of the lake's 3 identified dust hotspots: Farmington Bay in Davis County, Bear River Bay near Brigham City and Ogden, and the lake's northwest boundary in Box Elder County, more consistently than others. The families in those communities are breathing more of this air more often, with less access to medical care, less ability to move, and less political influence to demand a faster response. Now widen the lens, because the dust is only one dimension of what the lake's disappearance is doing. Great Salt Lake closed the 2025 water year at an elevation of 491, 1 feet in its south arm. That measurement ranks as the third lowest water year end level since records began in 1903 and places the lake firmly in what scientists describe as the serious adverse effects range. Isla Public. The phrase serious adverse effects is the language of the Great Salt Lake Comprehensive Management Plan, the official framework through which the state of Utah manages the lake. It has specific meaning. At this elevation, the lake's ecosystem is in documented distress. The brine shrimp populations that form the base of the food web are under pressure from rising salinity. The brine flies that feed millions of migratory birds are diminishing. The shrinking lake has raised concerns about the loss of flies and brine shrimp habitat, imperiling 10 million migratory birds that feed on them as they travel the Central Flyway. American Red Cross, 10 million migratory birds. The Great Salt Lake sits at the convergence of multiple flyways and functions as a critical refueling stop for species traveling between their winter grounds in Central and South America and their summer breeding grounds in Canada and Alaska. It is not a regional resource. It is a hemispheric one. When the brine shrimp disappear and the brine flies disappear, the birds that depend on them either find alternative habitat, which increasingly does not exist at the scale the lake once provided, or they do not complete their migrations. The collapse of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem is not something that stays in Utah. It propagates across the continent through the migratory species that link it to ecosystems thousands of miles away. There is a second systemic consequence that receives even less attention than the birds. The lake's decline has a warming feedback effect on snowpack. Reduced lake effect snow and accelerated snowmelt rates in adjacent mountains would undermine the ski industry and, more critically, reduce the spring runoff that the entire region depends on for its water supply. RNZ'd. The Wasatch Range that rises immediately east of Salt Lake City receives a significant portion of its winter precipitation as lake effect snow, moisture that evaporates from the Great Salt Lake, rises and falls as snow on the mountains above the city. As the lake shrinks and its surface area decreases, the moisture available for that process decreases. Less snow falls on the mountains, less snowmelt flows into reservoirs in spring, less water reaches the city's taps. The lake is not just disappearing, it is actively reducing the water supply of the 3 million people who live in its shadow. 30-year projections indicate that a sustained additional inflow of 800,000 acre-feet per year is necessary to return the lake to healthy levels by 2055. GRIST. That is nearly 3 decades of sustained, coordinated action at a scale that has never been achieved in the lake's history. Between 2021 and 2025, Utah managed to deliver roughly 400,000 acre-feet of water to the lake through a combination of water leasing, conservation programs, and Phragmites removal projects. That is a genuine achievement. It is also roughly half of what the lake needs annually, sustained for 30 years, to recover, and it was achieved during a period of political urgency that has not translated into the structural changes that would make it permanent. Agricultural use still accounts for the most water depletion in the basin, having dropped from 71 to 65% of total depletion since the 1990s. Municipal and industrial use has risen from 24 to 27%. Outdoor watering alone accounted for 400 to 500 acre-feet of water used on residential lawns in 2024, about a quarter of all agricultural consumption. CP24, residential lawn irrigation, in a desert state, on land adjacent to a lake that is hitting historic lows. Nearly 500,000 acre-feet of water used to keep grass green in a climate where grass does not naturally grow. The lake is telling the Wasatch Front something about its water use that the Wasatch Front has not yet fully absorbed. Utah has taken genuine steps. New laws have suspended most new water appropriations in the basin, expanded pathways for dedicating water to the lake, and created tools to better measure and manage water deliveries. State officials remain confident the lake can be restored to a minimum healthy level by 2034, when Salt Lake City hosts the Winter Olympics. GRIST. That 2034 target is real, and it has political momentum. A public-private charter called GSL 2034 has secured pledges toward a $200 million restoration goal, with Ducks Unlimited committing half. Utah's governor said publicly, "We will not let the Great Salt Lake fail." But here is what that political commitment is racing against. Utah's water managers are bracing for a dry summer and a shrinking lake, with every drop saved this spring being crucial in preventing another record low. Asia Times, snowpack across most of the lake's tributaries entered spring below normal. The Provo and Jordan River basins were at 68% of normal. The Weber River Basin was at 71%. The Bear River, the lake's single largest tributary, was the only bright spot at 104% of normal in its watershed. But combined, the picture entering the summer evaporation season was clear. The lake is going to lose more water than it gains between now and autumn. The USGS has already said it expects the level to drop another foot before the year's end. A woman named O'Brien, who moved to Salt Lake City from out of state, described what living downwind of the lakebed has become in her daily life. Her first asthma attack hit during a winter inversion. She had never had asthma before moving there. On dusty days, she experiences chest tightness, dizziness, and shortness of breath. She said, "I've had to use my inhaler multiple times a day during these episodes. I can feel bad air quality in my lungs before I even check the report." The Daily Caller. She is not alone. She is one data point in a public health pattern that is unfolding across the most populous region of a state whose fastest growing sector is residential development. Development that continues to push the Wasatch Front's population upward, increasing the number of people in the dust zone, increasing the demand for water in a basin that is already overallocated, and increasing the political pressure to protect lawns and golf courses and agricultural operations that together consume the water the lake needs to survive. Without significant intervention, experts have warned that if the Great Salt Lake dries up completely, the cities along the Wasatch Front will cease to exist and be replaced by urban graveyards and wastelands. They pointed to Owens Lake in California and the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan as examples. Los Angeles County spent over $5 billion trying to combat dust from Owens Lake. They eventually determined the only feasible solution was to refill the lake. The Daily Caller. The Aral Sea did not get refilled. It is now primarily a salt flat and dust basin in Central Asia, having lost 90% of its volume since the 1960s due to agricultural water diversions. The communities that surrounded it, fishing villages, resort towns, cities that depended on it for moisture and microclimate, are gone. The dust from its dried bed carries pesticides and salt and heavy metals across thousands of kilometers of Central Asia, reaching as far as the Arctic. That is what the far end of this trajectory looks like. Not in 2026, not in 2034. But the trajectory from the Aral Sea's 1960 conditions to its present state took 60 years. The Great Salt Lake has lost 2/3 of its surface area in roughly the same time frame. The mechanisms are different in their specifics, and the same in their structure. More water taken from the watershed than flows back in. A terminal lake with nowhere to go but down. Political systems that respond to the immediate demands of agriculture and development rather than the long-term demands of the ecosystem. A biology professor and director of Westminster University's Great Salt Lake Institute, Bonnie Baxter, called the lake's current state heartbreaking. She said, "It is terrifying just how close we are to breaking the historic low. How fast we return to the precipice should send a shockwave throughout northern Utah." RNZ. The record was broken in February. The USGS expects another foot of decline by autumn. The summer evaporation season is just beginning, and the 800 square miles of exposed lakebed that already exists, equal in area to all of Maui, is producing dust that enters the lungs of 3 million people, collects on the leafy vegetables in their gardens, absorbs into the soil beneath their feet, and accumulates in their bodies one windstorm at a time. Every drop saved this spring will be crucial in preventing the Great Salt Lake from hitting another record low. Asia Times. Spring is ending, the summer is coming. The lake is already at the lowest level recorded in 63 years of measurement, and the people who have spent their careers watching this body of water are using words like heartbreaking and terrifying, while the officials who manage it use words like stabilized and progress in 2034. At what point does a lake that breaks its own record in February, that is projected to drop another foot by autumn, that is exposing 800 square miles of toxic sediment to the wind above 3 million people stop being described as a challenge to be managed and start being described as an emergency that has already begun? And if the answer to that question keeps changing every time a new record is set, what record exactly will it take before the pace of the response matches the pace of the disappearance? The water is still dropping. The dust is still blowing. And somewhere in a low-income neighborhood on the Wasatch Front tonight, a woman is checking the air quality report before deciding whether to let her children play outside.